so much for coming on the podcast to chat with us today. So you're running as a socialist for the U.S. Senate in Wyoming, really
Yeah.
bucking the orthodoxy in your state with the party, with your campaign in general. Do you want to introduce yourself a little bit? Tell us who you are and why you're running to represent Wyoming in the Senate?
Sure. Well, I mean, I'm basically running because I feel like my kids are being handed a world of increasing instability, in terms of economics, in terms of our social systems, and in terms of our climate. And um, I was sitting back and watching Wyoming politics and realizing that there really wasn't somebody who was going to get in there and take on the underlying causes of that instability. And that there, even among the Democrats, there were people that would be like, I'll take on the Republicans, but there really wasn't anybody who was like, I'll take on either party,
Yeah.
depending on, what's actually needed. And, and I was clear that, with my activist background, I was really willing to be that person. And so that's what's motivating me. And so my background's mostly in the nonprofit and social change sector, and I've lived in intentional communities for most of my adult life, and that has a tendency to give you perspective that's 1 foot outside of the standard culture, and so I'm bringing all of that in with me.
Yeah, I wanted to talk to you a little bit more about that. You reached out to us actually and said that you're in Laramie, Wyoming at the House Solidarity Collective, Wyoming's only commune. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about that? It sounds really interesting.
Yeah. So we are, Wyoming's only. I think we're the only established intentional community at all. But we are a commune, which means that we share income and that we're really very much in each other's lives and having each other's backs and materially supporting each other, not just being a social support network for each other. And and that's definitely, like, sometimes I joke about, like, so there's Wyoming, that's this big red state, and then there's Laramie, that's a kind of liberal bubble within Wyoming's red state, and then we're the socialist bubble within the liberal bubble within the red state. And it's been great. I mean, we've been on this property for 2 years, and we've really created a space that is, not only a space that is LGBTQIA safe, which is very much needed in this state, but also one where people are able to really start learning about, like, well, what does leftist politics mean in a lived way, and having a space where those meetings can happen without fear of harassment has been really important, I think, to a lot of people.
So, I guess for a lot of people, if you could just give them an idea, what is the day-to-day living like on a commune? I feel like that's something that might be something that's of interest to people. I feel like a lot of misconceptions on what that might be like.
Yeah. Well, and we're still in the very new stages. And so we're still working on getting things established. So at this point, it's a lot of, like, we bought one of the oldest still standing buildings in the state of Wyoming. It was built in 1878. And because they used to be big families back then, and rich people would build big houses for big families, we have this really old building that's kind of like a mansion. And so we're spending a lot of time right now doing things like getting the plumbing working and, painting the house that had, not been painted in a lot of years, and that kind of stuff. And so, once we're established, it will look a little bit different, and we'll be doing more sort of sexy things than we are right now. But we share meals. And so we have a cooking rotation where everybody takes a turn once a week cooking, and then the rest of the time you just show up and eat. We have shared gardens. We're chicken farmers. So we've got a big old flock of laying hens, and we, sell our eggs in town. So, I mean, it's probably, if you take out all of the, like, sex and drugs stereotypes, that's probably, like, not too horribly inaccurate. We have a lot of meetings.
Yeah, that's
so
really
cool.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, we'd love to come check it out if when we do get our van up and running when we're in Wyoming. It sounds like
that would be
really
great. It'd be
project.
super fun. And we have a podcast too. We can do kind of dueling podcasts.
Yeah, definitely. That would be awesome. We'd love to do that. One of the things that we wanted to ask you about is Wyoming is it's a low population state. People are pretty spread out as far as we can tell. It's a larger state for the population size. We wanted to ask you about the impact of COVID-19 as there hasn't been a whole lot of national coverage of what's been going on in Wyoming as far as the COVID-19 crisis has. I imagine it's been impacted quite severely like the rest of the country. Could you just talk about how, pandemics like this impact rural communities, how easy it is to overwhelm the hospitals, that sort of thing?
Yeah, well, I mean, we sort of have a double-edged sword going on with this. I mean, on the one hand, it was slow to spread in Wyoming because we are so geographically dispersed everywhere except for on the reservation. So we have the seventh largest indigenous reservation in the country, and over half of the deaths that have happened in the state of Wyoming have been among tribal members who live on the res. And so even though our numbers are low in terms of like the overall death count, it has, like everywhere else, really disproportionately impacted people of color in the state. And, that said, it has been slower, and our governor, did a better job than some Republican governors have done, but I'd give him kind of a C+. He like
Be hard to do worse than somebody in Florida, maybe.
Yeah, definitely not worse than that. And also doesn't have as much national scrutiny, as you say, on him about what he's doing. And so, it's been like, it would be nice if you'd wear a mask, like not really what needs to be happening. So that's been tough. And we definitely have, there's a very clear political divide. Like, I am not a Democratic Party loyalist by any stretch of the imagination.
Neither are we.
Yeah, I know. Like, really, like I'm running as a Democrat, but I'm in that like tiny little like Ilhan Omar AOC slice of the party. That's my zone. But, I will say that there's a very clear correlation between the Democrats and the Republicans in terms of who's wearing masks and who isn't. Like, we had a candidate forum a couple weeks ago, and like literally every Democratic candidate showed up with a mask either on or in their pocket, kind of nervously going, am I going to put my mask on? And none of the Republicans did. And so I spent 2 weeks in quarantine. Thank you, Republicans in the state, coming out of that, because people have, on the Republican side, have very stubbornly been not really taking care of their neighbors right now. And so we are seeing, the second wave. Is it count as a second wave if it was
that's actually one of the other questions I wanted to ask for you today. Just this morning, NBC was covering that Donald Trump's campaign has decided to turn in a new direction as far as the coronavirus, and just say it's something that we have to live with. And that's kind of the campaigning model that they're going with. I just wondered what you would make of that, and do you think that the Democrats have responded adequately, or what kind of response would you give to something like that?
Yeah, well, I mean, the Democrats have responded better, and in some states have responded really well, I think. As far as like the federal level, I mean, they're not doing enough, and they went right along with the first bailouts were like, multi-million-dollar corporations that got bailed out. And I absolutely would have been kicking and screaming about that direction for the first chunk of federal money. And, and we've seen some really egregious things where like, there's this example of like a fossil fuel company that like took a ginormous bailout and then went to, what is the court? Sorry, I've been talking way too much.
Oh, no problem.
Bankruptcy court, and asked the judge to give basically almost the identical amount of money that they had taken as a bailout for executive payouts in the bankruptcy process. And it's like, this is just stealing from us flat out. And like, everybody in Congress knows that this is what's going to happen. And nobody's going like, fuck no, like, we're not going to do that. And so, I need more Democrats at the federal level saying fuck no in those moments. And there are not nearly enough of them that are willing to do that. And so, so it's one of those things where it's like, is it a lesser evil? Like, yeah, but it's still really bad. Yeah. And, we need that money to be going directly to people for like rent relief. We need it to be going to our rural hospitals. You asked about that. Like, our rural hospitals were already overwhelmed before this thing started, and it certainly hasn't gotten any better.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned that you weren't like you're running as a Democrat technically, but you're certainly not a party loyalist. And you're running for the Senate. Something that's really been kind of enraging me lately has been how the Democratic Party on a national level, the Chuck Schumers, the party leadership, they've been kind of pressing their thumbs on the scale of certain elections. In Kentucky, we saw them really propping up Amy McGrath, a candidate who is not exactly relatable to your average Kentuckian, over Charles Booker, who actually inspired a lot of enthusiasm about his run. But the problem was by the time people figured out who he was, there was a couple weeks left. We've seen this all across.
And they'd already spent $40 million of out-of-state money.
40, yeah, exactly.
Right. And people had already voted.
Yeah. An absentee.
We were already into the window,
yeah, voting ahead of time. Exactly. We've seen this in other races too that weren't quite as covered in Zach and I's home district in Kansas. We saw that happen with a populist Democrat, Brent Welder, running, who looked like he had some momentum behind him until the DCCC came in and basically funneled a bunch of money to his corporate opponent, who ended up edging him out by just like 2 points. What's the reaction been like from the party at a local level, but also the national level, if at all, to your candidacy? I'm sure that out of the Democrats that are running for Senate in Wyoming, you're definitely not their preferred candidate.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's kind of a blessing with Wyoming because nobody expects a Democrat to win. And, we are labeled safe red in like every rating that does that thing has us labeled as a safe red state. And so, we've been basically completely ignored by the DNC, and that is fine with me because I fully expect that if we weren't being ignored, the thumbs would be on any scale that I was not on. Yeah. So it's been okay for me. And I feel like, we started really early. I declared last year in June and was the only candidate in for a little while. And so we've had a year to be talking about socialism, to be talking about solidarity, to be getting young people actively involved in the political process who may have not otherwise been actively involved. And so I feel like we actually had the head start in a lot of ways. And we did that, for 2 reasons. One is we knew we had to if we were going to be able to win the primary and possibly have any shot at winning the general election. But also because there was so much education that we were going to need to be doing about what is socialism for real and what would it mean for Wyoming? And I feel like we've done a really good job with that second goal. And, I actually ended up on an interview with a couple folks who are in the press in the state and pay a lot of attention to what's happening statewide. And I asked them, I said, so it seems to me like the press is talking about socialism differently than they were when we started. And they were like, they are absolutely talking about it differently in Wyoming. And so I know that we've already made that impact, and we knew we were going to have to do that if we were going to have any shot at this. So we started really early, and so far, thank God, the DNC has given us 0 attention at all, which is awesome.
Has the reaction from voters been, good to what you're proposing?
Mostly, yeah. I feel like the thing is, I've shown up in the Democratic Party process this year. And one of the things that I did was I got on as a delegate to the state convention, and we actually got public banking and worker ownership, which is what socialism actually means, and a Green New Deal that takes care of fossil fuel workers. Our campaign got that into the state Democratic platform, and which was awesome. And we had a lot of support. Those votes were 81 to 86% yes among the Democratic leadership in the state. And so I actually feel like there's been a remarkably warm reception to it. And, and there's also been all sorts of funny moments, like being on an interview with a guy a couple months ago who kept going, wait, but who owns it? I was trying to explain to him what a worker cooperative was, and he just the mental block and watching the gears grinding really slowly. He's like, I don't understand, but what about the shareholder? There's no shareholders. The people who own it are the workers. Wait, but what does that mean? And so there's been some really interesting moments like that that have been sort of a mix of funny and appalling simultaneously.
Yeah.
There's been a concerted effort for the past, 100 years to beat the ethic of solidarity and organized labor out of the American workforce. But it is underlying it all what built the West of this country, which I believe, it's likely still ingrained in the population somewhere. You see that there are, labor strongholds in places like Butte, Montana. I'm sure there's, some in Wyoming as well. So that, I imagine there is a footing there for the left to get started. And one of the drums that Gavin and I have been beating since we started this podcast is that the left needs to reintegrate agrarian politics into their platform on a large level for a multitude of reasons. One, because I think there is so much overlap when you talk about healthcare and people's need to get, drugs that aren't overpriced. When you talk about people who want access to internet at a fair price. When you talk about people who see the climate changing around them. A lot of times it is those rural populations that see climate change firsthand. So I feel like there is a lot of overlap there. It's the messaging that we need to, reach out to those folks where it's just not been done. And a lot of that comes down to the fact that, the Democrats kind of got behind the whole managerial class and beating down the working class. And I just wondered if you could talk about trade policy and how that's viewed in Wyoming, and just kind of how working class politics influences the voters in Wyoming.
Well, I mean, we're a right to work state. And so, unions here have been, pretty beaten down.
Stomped out, yeah.
A lot of other places in the country. And, the thing is, there's not much statewide organizing happening in this state, period, about anything. And we, the good news is, I guess. So we had an immigration prison that was trying to get built on the west side of the state. And that was one of the first times where I really saw sort of statewide galvanization around an issue that was like a lefty issue. And it's not going to be built now. I mean, that was a win for our side. And I feel like that has helped plant a little bit of seeds for people of we could actually be doing organizing work in this state. And, and fossil fuels have a really strong lock on this state. And so when I've been out there talking about the Green New Deal, I mean, number one is I'm just totally matter of fact about yep, climate change is real. We need to actually do something about it. Yes, we're a fossil fuel state. I get that. So let's figure out how to take care of fossil fuel workers in that transition. And so, I think it's been a case of it's really, we've really had to lean more into the, working class solidarity message, which is great for me because I'm a socialist and that's what it's all about. Yeah. But, so it's like you couldn't just talk about the Green New Deal in the state and have it get anywhere without really clearly linking it to, the liberation of the working class. And so that's been how we've approached things. And, we're starting to see some balls getting rolling in that direction, I think. And part of it is, COVID-19 has sped up the collapse of coal in this state where it was already happening. People had been saying it for years that, okay, this is happening. But now it's all these people are suddenly going, oh shit, this is really happening. And so we've been able to say yep. And we've been talking about that since last June. And here's where we need to actually be working with coal miners. And we have people in our lives who are coal miners and who have been sort of frontlining that for a while. And so it's really been a matter of just planting the seeds that movement work is possible in this state and that we can be actually tying a bunch of these different issues together. And it's helped that I'm, openly bisexual. And so the queer community has really gotten behind this campaign from the beginning, and they've got a lot of connections into the working class world here. So so that's a little bit of what it's looked like.
That's really cool. I'm also interested in just what the primary process has been like and what you think it's going to be like when the primary happens on August 18th. What are your competitors like? Do you think that your chances are pretty good?
Well, I do, partly because there's 6 people in the primary, so we have record-setting number of people running in both parties for this seat this time. And so, I think that the serious competition are from, a guy named Nathan Wendt, who is clearly the party hack, moderate Democrat. He's all excited about a $10 an hour minimum wage. You are running to the right of the current U.S. House of Representatives who have already passed a $15 an hour minimum wage. Yeah. So, Nathan has the Jackson money behind him, which is where, the big Democratic money is in the state. And he's not doing a lot of campaigning. And his dad actually was the nominee for the U.S. House seat and ran against Cynthia Lummis, who is the probable Republican nominee for this seat this time. And so I think he's doing a lot of like, depending on his name recognition, which isn't even his name, it's his dad's name, and not really doing much in the way of campaigning. The other serious contender who is doing a really active campaign, and I think is doing a good campaign, is Marav Ben David, who is a climate scientist at the university here. And I think it's going to come down to the three of us, and I'm not really clear how exactly it's going to shake out, but my guess is that they will, between the two of them, will be splitting more of the traditional Democratic vote. The other three guys are either people who run constantly for some office or another and usually get 1,000 or 2,000 votes, or somebody who's utterly incoherent but claims he's a leftist. And so that's kind of what the field looks like.
And on the Republican side, you said there's also a primary, so there's no incumbent in this race.
There's no incumbent in the race, no.
Okay.
So Mike Enzi has been our senator. He will have been in office for 24 years. And so he is actually stepping down at this point. He's not going to run again. So we don't have an incumbent. We do have... so Cynthia Lummis is our former House rep from Wyoming, though. So she's the closest thing to an incumbent. And she's also put almost $600,000 of her own money into her campaign. So she's got the name recognition. She can claim that she's going to have more power than any of the rest of us could as soon as she steps into the Senate, which is true, that she would have seniority points that the rest of us wouldn't have. And she's a total Donald Trump party hack. She's running on, I will have Trump's back. That's her main talking point.
Well, do you think that if, regardless of who wins the nomination, but especially if you do you think the Democratic Party is going to be investing a lot of resources into it? Do you think they're going to be interested in trying to flip this state, or are they going to just, do you think, abandon it?
I think that, in terms of like the DNC?
Yeah, like, do you just think are they going to help you out if you win, or do you think they're just kind of leave you to, out there?
I don't know the answer to that. I do know that they have helped with Senate races before, but that has tended to be with more moderate Dems who are willing to go begging, and I'm not that. So I don't know. I do think that there will be some just basic support that will come to us, and that basic support will be significant for us. $50,000 would go a hell of a long way to do some real organizing work in this state between August 18th and November 3rd. So if we get that level of support, I think it will give us a real boost, but I don't expect them to suddenly look at this as like a potential hot spot, particularly if I'm the nominee. Like, I think almost anybody else is likely to get more support than I will from the party establishment.
I don't want to pivot too far, but just to go back to Donald Trump really quickly, his numbers nationally as far as approval rating have been plummeting. Is that something that you've seen reflected in the opinions of Wyoming voters? Do you think that, while it's likely that he loses a state like Wyoming in November, have you seen waning support, or are people still writing for Donald Trump as if the COVID-19 pandemic didn't happen?
Down happening in some ways in the state, where we're having the white supremacists show up as counter protesters at Black Lives Matter protesters, and they're all flying Trump flags for the most part. So there is some of that doubling down thing happening. I've been talking to Republicans since last June who really don't Trump. And so, are we still here?
Yeah, we're still here. Don't worry.
A little bit.
And now I can't hear you.
Oh, oops.
No worries. This is why we pre-record these.
Okay, I think we're back.
We good?
Yep. So yeah, if you just want to jump back into. Yeah. So if you could just take it from the top on, have you seen any waning support from the support for Donald Trump? We've seen his numbers plummet to historic lows in re-election years for candidates. It's almost like it took a pandemic for the public to start to realize that this was all a sham to begin with. I'm just wondering if that's a reaction or realization that Wyoming voters are coming to.
Mm-hmm. I think that there's multiple different things going on as far as his support. Number one is we're seeing a certain amount of doubling down where there's, white supremacist counter protesters showing up at Black Lives Matter protesters, fully armed, being super intimidating, many of them flying Trump flags. So there's that slice. I've also been talking to Republicans all along who really don't like Donald Trump and don't really know what to do with that. And I've obviously not been able to touch back to all of those conversations that I've had, but I'm suspecting that more of them are looking for some other candidate who is more of a populist. And I mean, that would be me. There's also massive infighting happening right now in the state Republican Party, where there was this attempt to like really crack down on rhinos, like Republicans in name only, and they actually ended up with fist fights at the Republican state convention this year that landed somebody in the hospital. So, the Republicans are kind of melting down in Wyoming right now. And I don't know how that's going to shake out. And I'm like so far from an insider in that world that I don't know what is actually going on. But it sure looks like 2020 is a wild card at the moment.
Yeah. With that being said, there's a lot to criticize Joe Biden for from the left for his long history of, whether it's the 1994 crime bill, which overwhelmingly incarcerated Black and brown men across this country, put over a third of the world's women in prison. In the United States, a third of the women in the world who are imprisoned in the United States. I mean, just disastrous things. There's the whole Anita Hill issue as we look at women's rights. There's the 2005 bankruptcy bill. Where do you find yourself, and where's your level of support for the man that is likely to become the president, but almost certain to become the nominee of the Democratic Party?
Yeah, I wish he would stop saying really racist and sexist crap. It's like it's one thing if, like, I've made mistakes in my life. It's one thing if this was like, 20 years ago or 5 years ago, but it's like he can't stop doing it.
It's almost like that's who he is.
I know it is. I think it's just like fundamental core to who he is. And so what I've been saying pretty much since Bernie dropped out, and have taken a lot of shit for it, is I want people to use their own judgment. Like, I think your vote is your discernment, and you get to figure out how to relate to a really problematic candidate like Joe Biden. And I don't know what I'm going to do.
I'm in a really similar conclusion. I've waffled back and forth on that. And I have serious ethical quandaries with, voting for somebody who has, cast their vote and done so many things that I disagree with, and also things that have promised to do things that I think are rapacious and illegitimate and illegal. But I do think that it is a tough decision when you have somebody who is, at first I thought that like Donald Trump is in action had been similar to somebody like Ted Cruz. I think, to be honest, his rhetoric was far beyond what Ted Cruz would have done. But I think as far as action, he would have caused about as much harm until recently, when he decided that he was going to turn, proffer turning the own U.S. Army against, peaceful protesters. I mean, there was chemical weapons that were used against peaceful protesters all across this country in the land of the free. I just wondered if you could speak a little bit about that and what kind of a storm you could cause from the Senate if that was happening under your watch.
Well, yeah, I mean, I definitely agree. Like, Donald Trump is completely out of control and he needs to not be the president. Totally 100% on board with that. And, and I have friends that have been tear gassed in multiple cities. And so, this is, the level of crackdown that's happening right now, which is really frustrating. Like, I used to be a police reformist. Like, I was actually in that movement before all of this started, and I've moved to being a police abolitionist. And, because of the crackdowns, and I think that started at the top. I mean, Donald Trump has supported that really fully. And so, as one senator, I probably won't be able to stop those things from happening if I'm in there while a Trump presidency is still happening. And you can sure as shit guarantee that there will be somebody there going, what are we doing? And calling it out really consistently and planting a flag further left than Bernie on a bunch of this stuff. And hopefully being able to anchor something that's a little bit further over. I also think that being a senator gives you a platform to speak truth to power, and, in some really intense ways. Like, if you're willing to not fully embrace the, oh, good, now I can do whatever I want because I'm an elected U.S. senator and now I can turn into one of the assholes. Like, if you're willing to not go there and continue to speak the things that got you elected as a populist and as an anti-racist and as a whole bunch of that other stuff, then I think that platform can help mitigate some of what's happening in our local communities. So I don't know if that's a real answer to your question or not, but that's sort of how I'm calculating it in my head.
On another similar note, I mean, we talk about calling out Donald Trump and what he's doing, which is, pretty easy to do. It's a pretty low bar to clear. Donald Trump obviously is not has no business being the president, as you said.
Right.
What I think is a little bit more difficult, though, is calling out the Democratic leadership for Democratic elected officials. We talk about Donald Trump using chemical weapons on protesters, but under the Obama administration, we saw chemical weapons employed on protesters at Standing Rock too. It's not like Donald Trump is this completely unique emergence of this evil. The Democrats are often just as complicit and just as culpable for similar crimes against humanity. It just goes kind of unchecked and unnoticed when they're in office, as it did for 8 years when Obama. Same with this foreign policy. I mean, how much of a stink was made about George Bush's foreign policy, but then the Democrats all went to sleep as soon as Obama was, bombing countries and intervening in Africa, when he all this ridiculous stuff that was totally going unchecked. If you were elected to the Senate, would you be unafraid to call out the Democratic leadership for these kind of horrendous things and this kind of hypocrisy that I've mentioned?
I don't know about unafraid, because I think it's a scary thing to do, but would I be willing to do it? Yeah, I would be in there doing it. I mean, and I've been saying on the campaign trail, look, like Obama is the one who got the Paris Accord watered down. Like, that was not a Republican who did that. That was a Democrat, and the most popular Democrat ever, who did it. Nancy Pelosi has enthusiastically supported all of the war budgets. Like, what are you doing, Pelosi? I mean, so yeah, I mean, I absolutely think that we need to be willing to call out both parties. And I actually said that at the Democratic convention. There were a bunch of people who were like, oh, I was like, I'm going to, we need to go there, not just to call out the Republicans, but to say, I'm going to have the backs of both parties when they're right. And I'm going to be in their faces if they're wrong about this kind of stuff. And so, I definitely to me, the line is not between Democrats and Republicans. It's between, neoliberalism and a police state on the one hand, and, democratic eco-socialism on the other hand. And that's clearly where I line myself. And so I'm going to be, I'm going to be tossing my rocks from that place, and not from I'm in the Democratic Party and now I'm sort of, becoming part of the club. I don't care about the club.
Just to take it back a little bit, you mentioned police abolition, prison abolition, and my radar went off a little bit. I wanted to talk to you. My personal politics were really radically influenced by the, prison abolition movement, people like Angela Davis, and that sort of writing. I wondered what steps you would take from a federal level to try and decarcerate this system. Angela Davis herself wrote that electoral politics was a liberal's panacea. It was worthless, and we needed to spend our energy on activism. And I wonder how you take the spirit of what she was saying to, decarcerate and free our people that we've, enslaved in this new form of slavery, largely our Black and brown men and women, and how we decarcerate them from an electoral political system that works against them.
Yeah. And, and again, it's going to be one voice that is in there. But, number one, we have to protect our rights to protest. I mean, the fact that crackdowns have been happening in states all over the country where it's you can't even be in the streets without facing long-term prison terms right now is totally appalling. And, I am definitely going to be in favor of ending private prison systems, that whole system, and the school to prison pipeline, all of that stuff I think is incredibly damaging to many of our communities, and particularly communities of color. And so, I think that we've got to take on that whole complex. So it's not just about the fact that slavery is still legal if you are incarcerated. It's not just about police reform. It's there's this whole actually intersected, system. And I think that we need to be looking at police reform that isn't just no chokeholds. It's okay, so chokeholds were illegal when Eric Garner died, in New York. That doesn't actually stop anything. I think that we need to have people who are willing to start advocating for bigger reforms, deeper reforms, and actually advocating for abolition. And I think one of the things that needs to happen is that I think every community in this country needs to have the right to have serious conversations about what does public safety mean, and what does that look like. And there are probably going to be some communities that are going to be like, yeah, we want something that looks like the police for part of that. But my guess is a lot of communities, if they were actually given the power to have those conversations and to be reinventing that system, that they actually would throw it out and they would be doing something really different. And so I'm very much a local rights advocate when it comes to policing decisions. And I think the feds can support that and can kind of get out of the way of local communities being able to have those conversations. And so that would be, one of the things that I'd be looking at.
Yeah, absolutely. One more question I had for you just about running as a socialist Democrat in the state of Wyoming is just how the media has treated your campaign, or if they've ignored you. Traditionally they're not very kind or fair to outsiders running for office on an unabashedly different platform from what the Democrats or Republicans are offering. Can you tell us a little bit about how you've been treated by the local media and also the mainstream media, if they've paid attention to you at all?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I've been ignored any more than any Democrat has, but I mean, Democrats kind of all get labeled as socialists. I mean, I think I've actually gotten more attention in some ways because I've been willing to go like, as a matter of fact, yes, I am a socialist. Yeah. Let's actually have that conversation. And there was this period of time, like late last year, before there were other Democratic candidates in this, where I got the sort of also ran treatment at the tail end of articles, and I was the Laramie Socialist was the way that I was tagged. So, I mean, I think there's been a little bit of that. But I mean, Democrats are treated like garbage in this state, period, for the most part. And there have been a couple reporters and a couple press outlets in the state that have gotten intrigued and have actually given me a lot of airtime and, have been able to like have real conversations with me about things. And that's been really terrific, actually. So, it hasn't been as bad as I thought it was going to be. I mean, let's put it that way. And I think the fact that, that I'm articulate, I'm not, going off in some like random direction. I will sit here and have a real intelligent conversation with you. I think over the course of the last year has helped a lot, that it's like, no, I'm going to show up and give you a real interview, and I'm going to like challenge you to think about things. And I'm going to talk, and I'm going to be like, we just made a public banking proposal, right? And how that would affect the state, right? And, and so I'm like, I know enough to like hold their feet to the fire a little bit more than I think a lot of people do. And, I think there's been a few times where it's like, we don't know what to do with this woman, but she's obviously smart. Yeah. And so there's been some of that. We talked recently with Lisa Savage, who's running as a Green in the state of Maine. And I think kind of similarly, like I think her intelligence, her down-to-earthness kind of disarmed people that were more expecting, from a Green candidate, more of like a crazy, scary leftist, and in reality, she's just a sweet, nice, conversational person like yourself. So yeah, cool. It's cool that, we have these candidates that are kind of educating people that, it's not necessarily a terrifying.
Yeah, shattering the norm or whatever.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, Yana, we've really enjoyed speaking with you today. Is there anywhere people can go to like support you or find out more about your platform and ideas if they want to support you?
Yeah, so our website is yana4yo.com, and that's sort of where all of the information is centralized. But we are on Facebook, we're on Twitter, we're just getting started on Instagram, we're on TikTok, so folks can find us on YouTube, can find us on any of those social media outlets. And I really encourage folks, if they're on Facebook, and I know that a lot of people aren't these days, but if you're on Facebook, we have a really big video library at this point of me talking about different issues, like everything from police reform to marijuana legalization, to the Green New Deal. There's a bunch of different stuff there that folks can check out. And most of them are closed captioned and on YouTube as well at this point. So that's kind of, if you want the in-depth, the videos are probably the place to get it.
Sweet. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for talking with us today. It was great speaking with you.
Yeah. Great. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, we look forward to speaking again. Laramie as well.
Yeah, that would be great. Come visit the commune. It'd be awesome.
Yeah, definitely.